December 21st, 2012, the day the world was supposed to end. Millions of people across the globe held their breath. Some had stockpiled food and water in underground bunkers. Others gathered with loved ones, certain these would be their final hours together. Doomsday preppers who had spent years preparing for this moment checked their supplies one last time, and then nothing happened. The sun rose on December 22nd, just like it always had. Life continued. The prophecy, it seemed, had been wrong. But here's the thing that nobody talks about. The panic never really ended. It just went quiet for a while. Fast forward to 2016. Astronomers at Caltech made an announcement that sent shockwaves through both the scientific community and the conspiracy theory world. They had found evidence of a massive planet lurking in the outer reaches of our solar system. Not Pluto. Something far bigger. Something that should not be there according to everything we thought we knew about our cosmic neighborhood. They called it Planet 9. And suddenly, all those dismissed theories about a hidden world beyond Neptune did not seem quite so crazy anymore. The timing was eerie. Just 4 years after the Mayan calendar prophecy supposedly failed, mainstream scientists were now admitting that yes, there might actually be another planet out there that we have never seen. A planet whose gravitational influence is affecting objects billions of miles from Earth. A planet that, by some estimates, could be 10 times the mass of Earth itself. And the internet exploded all over again. Social media groups dedicated to Planet X and Nibiru, which had gone dormant after the 2012 non-event, suddenly came roaring back to life. But this time, they had something the 2012 believers never had. They had scientists from one of the world's most prestigious universities saying that an unknown planet was out there. The conspiracy theorists felt vindicated. They had been right all along, they claimed. The establishment had just been lying about it. Now, before we go any further, we need to understand something important. The Planet 9 that scientists are looking for and the Nibiru of ancient prophecy are not the same thing, at least not according to mainstream astronomy. Planet 9, if it exists, is in a stable orbit that takes between 10,000 and 20,000 years to complete. It is not going to swing past Earth anytime soon. It is not on a collision course with our planet. It is just sitting out there in the dark, minding its own business. But try telling that to the millions of people who have seen the photographs, the unexplained objects in space telescope images, the weird gravitational anomalies that keep popping up in scientific papers, the strange patterns in how certain asteroids and comets move through our solar system, as if something big is pushing them around. In 2017, something strange happened at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. They released an official statement specifically denying the existence of Nibiru, not Planet 9. Nibiru. They felt compelled to address by name an ancient Sumerian planet that most mainstream scientists consider pure mythology. Why would the National Aeronautics and Space Administration waste time and resources debunking something that supposedly does not exist? That is what believers want to know. The agency does not release statements denying the existence of unicorns or leprechauns. So why Nibiru? The statement said that if Nibiru were real and headed toward an encounter with Earth, astronomers would have been tracking it for at least the past decade. It would be visible to the naked eye by now. It would be the brightest object in the sky besides the sun and moon. But here is what makes people suspicious. That same National Aeronautics and Space Administration operates facilities in remote locations around the world, including Antarctica, where access is severely restricted. The South Pole Telescope, for instance, is positioned in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. Why go to such extreme lengths unless you are looking for something you do not want the general public to know about? Then there are the government preparations that seem to coincide with these astronomical discoveries. In the past decade, we have seen a massive increase in disaster preparedness drills. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, has conducted more large-scale emergency exercises than at any other time in history. Bunker construction companies have reported record sales to private clients, including some very wealthy and well-connected individuals. Seed vaults have been established. Underground facilities have been expanded. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway, sometimes called the Doomsday Vault, holds over 1 million seed samples. It was built to survive any catastrophe, including asteroid impact and nuclear war. Coincidence? Maybe. But when you start connecting the dots, a pattern emerges that is hard to ignore. In 2019, another strange discovery made headlines. Astronomers found an object called 2014 UN 271, nicknamed the Goblin. This dwarf planet was discovered way out beyond Neptune, and its orbit suggested it was being influenced by something massive that we cannot see. The scientists who found it said its movement provided even more evidence for Planet 9. But they also noted something troubling. The orbit of the Goblin and several other distant objects showed clustering that could not be explained by known planets. Something was out there pulling these objects into similar paths. By 2020, amateur astronomers with backyard telescopes started reporting unusual observations, objects moving in ways that did not match known celestial mechanics, unexplained lights in the night sky, gravitational lensing effects that suggested something massive was bending light from distant stars. Most of these reports were dismissed as misidentifications or equipment errors, but there were so many of them, from so many different locations, that some researchers started paying attention. Social media made everything more intense. YouTube channels dedicated to Planet X and Nibiru theories now number in the thousands. Some have millions of subscribers. Every unusual astronomical event gets analyzed frame by frame. Every government statement gets scrutinized for hidden meanings. Every scientific paper about outer solar system objects gets downloaded and dissected by amateur researchers looking for clues. And here is what is really interesting. The people following these theories are not all fringe believers living in bunkers. Many are educated professionals, engineers, teachers, former military personnel, even some scientists who prefer to remain anonymous. They are not waiting for flying saucers or talking about reptilian overlords. They are simply looking at the evidence and asking questions that make the establishment uncomfortable. Hey, thanks for being here with me on this journey into one of the most fascinating mysteries of our time. If you are someone who questions the official narrative and wants to explore the evidence that mainstream media would rather you ignore, you are in exactly the right place. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what we are about to uncover in this documentary will challenge everything you thought you knew about our solar system and our ancient past. Trust me, you will want to see where this goes. The 2012 prediction may have been wrong about the date, but what if it was not wrong about the event? What if the ancient Sumerians, who somehow knew about planets that modern humans did not rediscover until the invention of the telescope, were not talking about 2012 at all? What if their timeline was just slightly off? Or what if we misunderstood how to calculate their calendar in the first place? This is where things get really interesting, because when you start looking at what the ancient texts actually say, when you examine the original Sumerian tablets without the filter of mainstream archaeology, a very different picture emerges. A picture of a planet that returns like clockwork every 3,600 years. A planet that brings with it massive changes to Earth. A planet whose inhabitants, according to ancient accounts, were the ones who created human civilization in the first place. The panic of 2012 never really ended. It just evolved. It got smarter. It got backed by more evidence. And now, with every new astronomical discovery, with every unexplained gravitational anomaly, with every official denial that seems just a little too defensive, the question grows louder. Is something out there, hidden in the darkness beyond Neptune, following an ancient orbital path that will soon bring it back into view? And if so, what happens when it arrives? The story begins in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, in what is now modern-day Iraq. Buried beneath thousands of years of sand and forgotten history, archaeologists in the 1800s began uncovering clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped writing. Cuneiform, they called it, the oldest known form of writing on Earth. And what these tablets contained would eventually spark one of the most controversial theories in human history. Most people have never actually seen these tablets. They sit in climate-controlled rooms at the British Museum, the Louvre, and universities around the world. Fragile pieces of baked clay, some no bigger than your hand, covered in tiny pressed marks that tell stories from over 4,000 years ago. Stories about gods who came from the sky, stories about creation, stories about a planet that the Sumerians called Nibiru. Now, here is where things get complicated. The academic establishment will tell you one thing about these tablets. A man named Zecharia Sitchin told you something completely different. And the gap between these two interpretations is not just wide, it is a canyon. Zecharia Sitchin was not a trained archaeologist or a credentialed Sumerian scholar. He was a journalist and author who taught himself to read cuneiform. And according to every mainstream academic who has reviewed his work, he got it catastrophically wrong. They say he mistranslated words, invented meanings, and saw things in the texts that simply are not there. But here is the thing that makes this whole debate so fascinating. Sitchin's books have sold millions of copies. His ideas have influenced countless researchers. And despite being dead since 2010, his theories are more popular now than ever before. So what did Sitchin claim he found? According to his translation of tablets like the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, the Sumerians had detailed knowledge of our entire solar system, not just the planets visible to the naked eye, like Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, but also Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, planets that modern humanity did not discover until we had telescopes. How could ancient people who supposedly thought the Earth was flat and the center of the universe have known about planets billions of miles away? Sitchin pointed to specific cylinder seals, small carved stones that Sumerians would roll across wet clay to create images and text. One seal in particular, catalogue number VA 243 at the Berlin Museum, became the centerpiece of his theory. On this seal, dated to around 2400 before Christ, there is an image that Sitchin interpreted as our solar system, a central star, the Sun, surrounded by 11 celestial bodies. If you count them out, you get Mercury, Venus, Earth, the Moon, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and one more. A 12th planet that the Sumerians placed between Mars and Jupiter. Mainstream archaeologists absolutely hate this interpretation. They say the image is not a solar system map at all. It is just decorative, they claim, or it represents stars in a constellation, or it is religious symbolism that has nothing to do with astronomy. They point out that nowhere in authenticated Sumerian texts does it explicitly say they knew about Uranus or Neptune. The word Nibiru appears in texts, yes, but they say it referred to Jupiter, or to a star, or to a celestial crossing point, not to an actual planet beyond Neptune. But then how do you explain this? The Sumerians had a number system based on 60. We still use it today when we measure time and angles. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. Where did they get this sophisticated mathematical system? And why 60? Some researchers suggest it is because 60 is easily divisible by many numbers, which makes calculations easier. But others wonder if there is a deeper, astronomical reason we have not figured out yet. The Enuma Elish itself tells a creation story that sounds nothing like the Genesis account from the Bible, even though both cultures existed in the same region. The Sumerian version describes celestial battles between planetary bodies. It talks about a planet called Tiamat that was destroyed in a cosmic collision, and from its remains, the Earth and the asteroid belt were formed. This is not mythology that sounds like primitive people trying to explain thunder and rain. This sounds like people describing planetary formation and cosmic collisions, events that modern astrophysics has confirmed actually happen. In the tablets, the beings who came from Nibiru were called the Anunnaki. The name translates, even according to mainstream scholars, as those who from heaven came to earth. Not a metaphor, not poetry. A literal description. They came from the sky to the ground. The texts describe these beings in very specific terms. They had advanced technology, they performed genetic experiments, they created workers to mine gold. And yes, according to these ancient accounts, those workers were us, human beings. Now let us be very clear about something. The academic community does not accept this interpretation. Scholars like Michael Heiser, who actually has a doctorate in ancient Semitic languages, has written entire books debunking Sitchin's translations. Heiser argues that Sitchin confused similar-sounding words, ignored grammatical context, and basically saw what he wanted to see. He points out that the word Anunnaki simply meant the principal deities of the Sumerian pantheon, nothing more. They were not aliens. They were gods in a mythological sense, like Zeus or Odin. But here is where the debunkers run into their own problems. If the Anunnaki were just mythological gods, why do the Sumerian king list and other historical documents treat them so matter-of-factly? The Sumerian king list, which is accepted as a legitimate historical document, lists kings who ruled for thousands of years before a great flood. After the flood, it lists kings with normal human lifespans. The text does not present this as mythology, it presents it as chronological history. Kings who ruled for 36,000 years are listed right alongside kings who ruled for 25 years, in the same documentary style, with no indication that one section is myth and another is fact. And then there is the problem of Sumerian astronomical knowledge that keeps popping up where it should not exist. The Mul-Apin tablets, dated to around 1000 before Christ, but copying much older sources, contain star catalogues and planetary movement predictions that required centuries of careful observation. These were not primitive people looking up at pretty lights in the sky. They were tracking celestial mechanics with precision. They knew the orbital periods of planets. They predicted eclipses. They understood the precession of the equinoxes, a 26,000-year cycle that requires multi-generational observation to detect. How? The standard academic answer is that they were just very patient and very dedicated astronomers who passed knowledge down through generations. That is possible. Humans are capable of remarkable achievements, but it does not explain why their mythology describes these astronomical bodies as actual places that beings traveled from. It does not explain why their creation stories read like descriptions of planetary formation rather than simple nature myths. Let us talk about one specific tablet that makes scholars very uncomfortable. It is called the Atrahasis, and it tells the story of human creation in disturbing detail. According to this text, the Anunnaki came to Earth to mine gold. They needed it for purposes the tablet describes, though the exact translation is debated. The mining work was brutal, and the lower-ranking Anunnaki, called the Ajiji, eventually rebelled. They went on strike. They refused to work. So the leadership decided to create a primitive worker species by mixing their own genetic material with that of an existing creature on Earth. The tablet describes a process that sounds remarkably like genetic engineering. They took the essence of a young Anunnaki male, mixed it with clay, which some interpret as the genetic material of Earth creatures, and created Adamu, the first human. This is not a metaphor about God breathing life into dust. This is a recipe, a procedure, step by step, instructions that ancient people should not have had any framework for understanding, let alone describing. Mainstream scholars say it is just a creation myth, no different from dozens of others around the world. But other creation myths talk about gods speaking things into existence, or cosmic eggs hatching, or giants being slain to make the world. The Sumerian account talks about genetic mixing, gestation periods, and multiple attempts before success. It reads less like a myth and more like a lab report. And here is something that almost nobody talks about. The Sumerians were not the only ancient culture describing something like this. The Hindu Vedas talk about vimanas, flying machines used by the gods. The Egyptian texts describe gods who came from the sky and brought knowledge. The Dogon tribe in Africa has mythological accounts of beings from the Sirius star system teaching them astronomy. Independently, cultures all over the world tell stories of sky gods who came down and uplifted humanity. Either this is the most remarkable coincidence in human history, or these cultures were describing something real that they all experienced. Now, where are you watching this from? Whether you are in the Americas, Europe, Asia, Africa, or anywhere else on this planet, your ancestors probably have stories about beings who came from above and changed everything. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And if you are finding this exploration into our hidden history as fascinating as I am, make sure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on. We are just getting started, and trust me, the evidence gets even more compelling from here. The problem with the Sitchin translations is not necessarily that he was wrong about everything. Even his critics admit that he raised important questions. The problem is that he made very specific claims about very specific translations, and when actual Sumerian scholars checked his work, they found errors. But finding errors in his grammar does not automatically mean his overall thesis is wrong. It just means he may have gotten some details incorrect while stumbling toward a larger truth. Consider this. The Sumerians appear in history suddenly, around 5000 before Christ, already possessing advanced knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, and governance. They did not gradually develop these things. They showed up with them fully formed. They built ziggurats, massive temple complexes, using engineering principles that modern architects respect. They had a legal system, a tax system, and organized religion. And then they wrote down stories about beings from another planet who taught them all of this. The mainstream explanation is that they independently invented all of these advances in a relatively short period of time, and then they invented a mythology to explain their own success by attributing it to gods. That is the official story. But it requires you to believe that people who had been hunter-gatherers for tens of thousands of years suddenly figured out complex irrigation, metallurgy, writing, and advanced mathematics all at once, in one place, with no apparent precursor civilization to learn from. Or you can consider the alternative, that they wrote down exactly what happened, that beings from somewhere else, whether another planet in our solar system or from beyond, arrived and jump-started human civilization, and that those beings came from a place the Sumerians called Nibiru. The tablets exist. They are real physical objects you can go see in museums. The words on them are not disputed, only their interpretation. The Sumerians clearly believed something arrived from the heavens and changed their world. The question is not whether they believed it. The question is whether they were right. And speaking of belief, I am curious about something. Wherever you are right now, listening to this story unfold, what time is it where you are? Are you watching this late at night, going down a rabbit hole you did not plan on exploring? Or maybe it is morning where you are, and you are starting your day by questioning everything you thought you knew about human history. Drop a comment and let me know what part of the world you are tuning in from. It is fascinating to think that people all across this planet, descendants of all these ancient cultures we have been discussing, are right now wondering the same thing. Were our ancestors trying to tell us something gensid important? Because if the Sumerians wrote down exactly what happened, if beings from somewhere else really did arrive and jumpstart human civilization, then those beings came from a place the Sumerians called Nibiru. And if Nibiru is real, if it follows the orbit they described, then the most important question is not where it came from. It is when it comes back. Picture this. You are a Sumerian farmer 5,000 years ago, working in the fields under a blazing Mesopotamian Sunday. Suddenly, something descends from the sky. Not a bird, not a natural phenomenon. Something that moves with purpose, that shines like metal, that lands with a force that shakes the ground beneath your feet. Beings emerge. They are taller than you. They possess tools that seem like magic, and they speak with authority that makes kings bow down. What word would you use to describe them? You would call them gods. But what if they were not? The Anunnaki were not a vague concept in Sumerian religion. They had names, specific roles, detailed family trees. Anu was the sky god, the king, the supreme authority who rarely came to earth but ruled from above. His son Enlil was the lord of the air, the administrator who managed operations on earth. Another son, Enki, was the lord of the earth and waters, the scientist, the genetic engineer, according to the texts. Then there was Ninmah, the mother goddess involved in the creation of humans. Ninhursag, the nurse. Inanna, later known as Ishtar, the ambitious one who wanted more power. These were not abstract divine concepts. These were individuals with personalities, ambitions, conflicts, and very human-sounding drama. The texts describe their hierarchy like a corporate structure or military command. There were the high-ranking Anunnaki, who made decisions. Below them were the Igigi, the workers who did the actual labor until they rebelled. And then humans were created to replace the Igigi in the mining operations. This does not sound like mythology. It sounds like an organizational chart. Let us get specific about what these texts actually say these beings did. According to the Atrahasis epic, the Anunnaki were mining operations in what is now Southeast Africa. Gold specifically. They dug it from the earth in enormous quantities. But why would gods need gold? Gods, in the mythological sense, do not need physical resources. They are supposed to be all-powerful, creating things from nothing. Yet the Sumerian texts repeatedly emphasize that the Anunnaki needed gold, that they worked hard to extract it, and that this work was so difficult it caused labor disputes. Some researchers have proposed that an advanced civilization would need gold for technological purposes. Gold is an excellent conductor. It does not corrode. It reflects radiation. If you were trying to protect a planet with a deteriorating atmosphere, for instance, you might suspend gold particles in the upper atmosphere to reflect solar radiation. Speculative? Absolutely. Impossible? Not according to modern materials science. Then there is the disturbing detail about how humans were created. Multiple tablets describe the process. Enki and Ninmah conducted experiments. The first attempts failed. They created beings with defects, with missing limbs, with inability to reproduce. Finally, they succeeded in creating a being that could work, follow instructions, and breed. They called this prototype Adamu, which even mainstream scholars admit is linguistically related to the Hebrew Adam and means earthling or one made from earth. But here is what makes modern geneticists uncomfortable. The tablets describe mixing the essence of the Anunnaki with the essence of an existing earth creature. They describe implantation into female Anunnaki wombs for gestation. The text even specifies that multiple birth goddesses were used simultaneously to speed up the production of workers. This is not a poetic description of a god molding clay. This reads like industrial-scale genetic engineering with quality control problems. And the Bible, written thousands of years later, contains an echo of this story that everyone ignores. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown, sons of God mating with human women, producing hybrid offspring, giants, heroes. This appears in the Bible, not in some fringe apocryphal text, but right there in Genesis. And for 2,000 years, theologians have been uncomfortable with these verses because they do not fit the standard religious narrative. Who were these sons of God? Why does the text distinguish them from humans? And why does God immediately afterward decide to flood the earth, as if these unions created a corruption that needed to be eliminated? The Sumerian texts provide context that the Bible strips away. The Anunnaki, according to the older Mesopotamian accounts, did exactly this. They interbred with humans. Some of the tablets describe it as unauthorized, as breaking rules set by the leadership. Other texts describe it as creating a royal bloodline, humans with Anunnaki genetics who would rule over regular humans. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving works of literature, describes its hero as 2/3 God and 1/3 human. Not metaphorically divine, genetically hybrid. Gilgamesh possessed superhuman strength. He lived far longer than normal humans. He went on a quest for immortality because he could not accept death the way full humans did. And the text treats all of this as historical fact, not as a superhero origin story. It presents Gilgamesh as a real king of Uruk who actually lived, who actually did these things, who was actually partially Anunnaki. Now, the conventional explanation for all of this is that ancient people created elaborate mythologies to explain natural phenomena, to justify their social hierarchies, and to make sense of a world they did not understand scientifically. Kings claimed divine ancestry to legitimize their rule. Priests invented stories about gods to maintain their power. None of it was real. It was all political theater and primitive psychology. But that explanation falls apart when you look at how the Sumerians talked about the Anunnaki versus how other cultures talked about their gods. Greek gods were clearly metaphorical. They embodied concepts. Zeus was power and sky. Aphrodite was love and beauty. Hades was death and the underworld. They lived on a mythical mountain. They were never presented as having arrived from somewhere real and tangible. The Anunnaki came from Nibiru, a specific place. They traveled through space. They landed on Earth. They built cities in specific locations that we can still identify today. Eridu, the first city according to Sumerian records, was supposedly built by Enki when he first arrived. And guess what archaeologists found when they excavated the site? Evidence of settlement, dating back to at least 5,400 before Christ, making it one of the oldest continuously occupied sites in Mesopotamia. The mythology pointed to a real place with a real ancient history. The texts describe the Anunnaki as essentially immortal from a human perspective, but not truly eternal. They aged very slowly. They could be killed. They got sick, though rarely. They needed food and water. They experienced emotions like jealousy, anger, and love. These are not descriptions of omnipotent divine beings. These are descriptions of advanced biological entities with much longer lifespans than humans. And their technology, as described in the tablets, sounds less like magic and more like science we are only now beginning to achieve. They had flying vehicles called sky chambers that roared like bulls and shook the earth when they landed. They had weapons that could destroy cities, which some researchers have compared to descriptions of nuclear weapons. After the supposed destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the Bible describes Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt when she looked back at the devastation. Lot himself is warned not to look directly at it. That sounds less like divine fire and more like radiation exposure. The Sumerian text called the Era Epos describes a devastating weapon used by the Anunnaki during one of their conflicts. It talks about a brilliant flash followed by destruction so complete that nothing could grow in the affected area for generations. It describes people's skin falling off, hair falling out, and dying slowly after exposure. When archaeologists excavated certain sites in ancient Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, they found layers of green glass, the kind created when sand is exposed to extreme heat like a nuclear blast. They found skeletons with radiation levels higher than normal background radiation even thousands of years later. Mainstream science attributes these findings to meteorite impacts or unusual geological activity, but the ancient texts describe them as weapons used in the wars of the gods. Coincidence? Or eyewitness accounts written by people who did not have the scientific vocabulary to properly describe what they witnessed? Here is the real question that nobody wants to confront directly. If the Anunnaki were just mythology, just metaphor, just primitive people's attempt to explain the world, then why are the descriptions so specific, so technological, so consistent across thousands of years and multiple cultures? And why do modern advances in genetics, aerospace, engineering, and physics keep making the ancient descriptions sound less like fantasy and more like badly explained science? We are learning to edit genes with CRISPR. We are discussing colonizing Mars. We are debating the ethics of creating human-animal hybrids for organ harvesting. We are building artificial intelligence and worrying about what happens when we create something smarter than ourselves. Every single one of these modern dilemmas appears in the ancient texts as something the Anunnaki already did. They edited genetics. They established colonies on another planet, ours. They created hybrid species. They built artificial servants who eventually rebelled. And according to the tablets, it did not end well for them either. Their civilization on Earth collapsed. Wars broke out between different Anunnaki factions. Humans, their creation, multiplied beyond control and began developing their own culture, their own ambitions. The Great Flood, which appears in Sumerian texts long before it appears in the Bible, was either a natural catastrophe that the Anunnaki leadership allowed to happen, or according to some interpretations, actively caused in order to reset their failed experiment. But some humans survived. The Sumerian version says Enki warned a human named Ziusudra to build a boat. The Bible calls him Noah. Same story, different names. And after the flood, the texts say the Anunnaki had a debate. Should they recreate civilization with humanity or leave Earth entirely? They chose to stay, but to take a step back, to guide from a distance rather than rule directly, to establish human kings who had just enough Anunnaki blood to be controllable, but who appeared human enough to be accepted by the population. Every royal house in the ancient world claimed descent from the gods. Egyptian pharaohs were literal gods incarnate. Japanese emperors descended from Amaterasu. the sun goddess. European kings ruled by divine right. What if this was not propaganda? What if it was genealogy? The question of whether the Anunnaki were gods, aliens, or metaphor might be the wrong question. Maybe they were none of those things and all of those things. Beings from elsewhere, advanced enough to seem divine to primitive humans, but biological and mortal enough to die, to need resources, to make mistakes. Not metaphors, not myths, not omnipotent deities. Just people from somewhere else who came here a very long time ago and changed everything. And if the 3,600-year cycle is real, if Nibiru's orbit really does bring it back into the inner solar system on a predictable schedule, then the Anunnaki might come back too, not as returning gods, but as ancient colonizers checking on their abandoned experiment. 3,600 years. That number keeps appearing in places it has no business being. The Sumerians called it a Shah, one complete orbit of Nibiru around the Sunday, one cosmic year for the planet of the gods. But here is what makes researchers lose sleep at night. When you start mapping major catastrophic events in Earth's history and line them up on a timeline, that number starts showing up with a frequency that defies comfortable explanation. Let us start with something that both mainstream science and alternative researchers agree actually happened. 12,800 years ago. Something devastated Earth. We are not talking about gradual climate change or a bad winter. We are talking about an extinction-level event that geologists call the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis. Temperature records from ice cores show global temperatures plummeting within decades. Massive animals that had survived previous ice ages suddenly went extinct. Mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant sloths, all gone within an incredibly narrow window of time. The evidence is everywhere once you know what to look for. A black mat layer appears in geological records across North America, a dark sediment band that marks the boundary between the Pleistocene and what came after. It contains nanodiamonds, microscopic structures that only form under extreme heat and pressure. It contains iridium, an element rare on Earth's surface, but common in asteroids. It contains spherules, tiny glass beads created when rock melts and cools rapidly in the atmosphere. This is impact debris. Something hit us. Something big. But here is where it gets interesting for our investigation. 12,800 years ago. Now divide that by 3,600. You get 3.55, close to 3.5 cycles. Not perfect, but disturbingly close considering we are dealing with geological dating that has margins of error. And if you accept that the cycle might not be exactly 3,600 years every single time, that it might vary slightly due to gravitational influences from other planets, then the match becomes even more compelling. Now, jump forward. 9,000 years ago, approximately 7,000 before Christ, another dramatic climate shift occurred. Sea levels rose rapidly. Coastal civilizations, if they existed, would have been swallowed by the oceans. The Black Sea, which was previously a freshwater lake, was suddenly flooded by seawater crashing through the Bosphorus Strait with the force of 200 Niagara Falls. Any settlements on its shores would have been obliterated in days. Some researchers believe this catastrophic flooding is the real historical basis for the flood myths that appear in every ancient culture. 9,000 years ago. Subtract that from 12,800. You get 3,800 years. Again, not exactly 3,600, but close enough to make you wonder. Especially when you consider that ancient dating methods were not precise, and neither are our modern techniques when dealing with events this far in the past. Keep going. 5,500 years ago, around 3,500 before Christ, we see the rise of the first true civilizations. Sumerian cities appear seemingly out of nowhere. The first Egyptian dynasties begin. The Indus Valley civilization starts organizing. And all of them, independently, suddenly develop writing, mathematics, astronomy, and complex social structures within a few centuries of each other. Why then? Why did humans, who had been doing mostly the same thing for tens of thousands of years, all suddenly level up at the same time on different continents? The mainstream answer is that agriculture reached a critical mass that allowed for specialized labor and urban development. That is probably part of the truth. but it does not explain the sophistication of what appeared. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built around 4,500 years ago, required mathematical and engineering knowledge that we struggle to fully understand today. It aligns perfectly with true north. Its dimensions encode the mathematical constant pi and the golden ratio. Its internal passages align with specific stars. This was not humanity's first attempt at building something big. This was a masterpiece created by people who clearly knew exactly what they were doing. 4,500 years ago. Not quite a perfect 3,600-year interval from the previous event, but we are now in the range where historical records exist, and the dates get more reliable. And if the cycle is not perfectly regular, if it has some variation, then we are still tracking something real. Now here is where it gets uncomfortable. 1,800 to 2,000 years ago, right around the time of Christ, and shortly after, we see another period of massive civilizational disruption. The Roman Empire, the most powerful political entity on Earth, begins its slow collapse. The Mayan civilization in Central America mysteriously abandons its cities. Climate records show unusual cold periods and drought. There are accounts of famines, plagues, and social upheaval across the ancient world. Some of this can be explained by human political and social factors. But the climate disruptions? Those show up in tree ring data and ice cores. Something environmental was happening. And if you count backward from today, 2,000 years ago fits disturbingly well into a 3,600-year pattern, allowing for the variation we have been seeing. Which brings us to right now. If the cycle continued, if there is any reality to this pattern at all, we would be approaching another interval. Not exactly at it, but close enough that if there is a margin of error in the cycle, we could be entering the window, and that is exactly when mainstream astronomers announce they have found evidence of Planet 9. That is exactly when unusual gravitational anomalies start being detected in the outer solar system. That is exactly when NASA feels compelled to issue official denials about Nibiru. Timing is everything, and these timings are making people very nervous. But let us apply some critical thinking here before we go too far down the rabbit hole. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We find patterns even in random noise. It is how our brains work. So we need to ask, are these dates actually significant? Or are we selecting data that fits a pattern we want to see while ignoring data that does not? Fair question. So let us look at what does not fit. There should be evidence of catastrophic events every 3,600 years like clockwork throughout geological history. When scientists examine sediment cores and ice cores going back hundreds of thousands of years, do they find regular disasters spaced 3,600 years apart? Not exactly. What they find is more complicated. There are periods of relative stability lasting tens of thousands of years, interrupted by sudden catastrophes that seem to cluster in certain eras. The past 20,000 years, the period since the last glacial maximum, shows more dramatic climate shifts and extinction events than the previous 80,000 years. It is as if something changed about 20,000 years ago that made Earth's climate and ecosystem more volatile, or as if something started visiting our neighborhood more regularly. Orbital mechanics provides another angle to examine this. Could a planet actually have a 3,600-year orbit in our solar system? According to astrophysicists, yes, mathematically it is possible. A highly elliptical orbit that brings a planet close to the Sun and then flings it far out into the darkness could have that kind of period. Planet 9, the one scientists are actually looking for, has an estimated orbital period of 10,000 to 20,000 years, different from 3,600, but it proves that planets with extremely long orbits can exist in our solar system. The question is not whether such an orbit is possible. The question is whether an orbit that extreme would remain stable over billions of years. Gravitational interactions with Jupiter and Saturn would tend to either eject a planet from the solar system entirely or pull it into a more circular orbit over time, unless the planet is extremely massive, in which case its own gravity helps stabilize its path, or unless it has not been orbiting for billions of years, but was captured more recently in cosmic terms, perhaps only a few million years ago. Ancient astronomers had sophisticated knowledge of cycles. The Mayans tracked Venus with incredible precision. The Babylonians could predict eclipses. The builders of Stonehenge aligned their monument with solstices and lunar standstills. These were not casual observers. They were dedicated scientists conducting multi-generational research projects. If a bright object appeared in the sky every 3,600 years, staying visible for months or years before disappearing again, ancient astronomers absolutely would have tracked it. They would have recorded it. They would have predicted its return. And according to researchers like Sitchin, that is exactly what the Sumerian tablets represent. Not mythology, astronomy. Records of orbital periods and return trajectories passed down through generations of priest astronomers who knew something was coming back, who knew when, who encoded that knowledge in stories and symbols so it would survive even if their civilization fell. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which predates the Bible by over 1,000 years, describes a great flood that destroyed the world. The hero Utnapishtim survives by building a boat and loading it with animals and seeds. Sound familiar? But the Sumerian version includes details that the Bible omits. It says the gods, the Anunnaki, debated whether to warn humans. Most voted to let humanity perish. Only Enki defied the council and warned Utnapishtim in secret. Why would the gods want humans dead? The text implies they had failed in their purpose, that the human experiment had gotten out of control, or that something was coming that would devastate the surface of Earth. And the Anunnaki did not want to deal with rebuilding civilization afterward. Easier to start over with a clean slate. Except Enki, who supposedly created humans in the first place, could not bring himself to let them all die, so he saved a remnant, just enough to repopulate after the disaster passed. If we take this text at face value, it describes advanced beings with foreknowledge of a coming catastrophe. They knew it was coming because it had happened before, because there was a cycle, because the destroyer returned on schedule. 3,600 years, a cosmic heartbeat, a celestial timekeeper, or the most elaborate coincidence in human history. You get to decide which explanation you find more plausible. But before you do, ask yourself this. Why would the Sumerians, who gave us writing, mathematics, law codes, and the wheel, who were clearly intelligent and rational people, dedicate so much effort to recording and calculating this specific number if it meant nothing? Why would they pass it down for thousands of years if it was just a myth? Numbers do not lie. People do, sometimes. And people make mistakes often. But when the same number appears in ancient texts, in geological records, in climate data, and in modern astronomical calculations, maybe it is not a myth or a mistake. Maybe it is a warning we forgot how to read. January 20th, 2016. Caltech astronomers Konstantin Batygin and Mike Brown walked into a press conference and dropped a bomb on the scientific community. They had not found a new planet. They had found something arguably more significant: mathematical proof that a massive planet must exist in the outer solar system. Not speculation, not theory, math. Their paper, published in the Astronomical Journal, presented evidence so compelling that even skeptical astronomers had to admit something weird was happening out past Neptune. 6 distant objects in the Kuiper belt, each with orbits that take thousands of years to complete, were all tilted in the same direction, all clustered at similar angles. The odds of this happening randomly? About 0.007%, 1 in 15,000. Something massive was pulling these objects into alignment, something with roughly 10 times Earth's mass, something that has never been directly observed. Mike Brown is not some fringe researcher you can dismiss. He is the astronomer who killed Pluto. In 2005, he discovered Eris, a dwarf planet bigger than Pluto, which forced the astronomical community to either accept dozens of new planets or redefine what a planet is. They chose the latter. Pluto got demoted. Brown wrote a book, literally titled How I Killed Pluto and Why It Had It Coming. This is not a man given to wild speculation or entertaining conspiracy theories. So when he says, there is a planet out there, people listen. But here is what Brown and Batygin will not say publicly, even though the math screams it. If this planet exists, where they think it does, at a distance of 200 to 1,200 astronomical units from the Sun, with an orbital period of 10,000 to 20,000 years, then it has probably been swinging through our solar system for a very long time. And every time it comes through the inner system, its gravity would wreak havoc on smaller objects. Comets would get flung toward the sun, asteroids would get knocked out of stable orbits. The orbits of the outer planets themselves would wobble slightly. Does this match the historical record? You tell me. In 2014, before Brown and Battigan published their research, astronomers Chad Trujillo and Scott Shepard discovered an object they nicknamed the Goblin. Its official designation is 2014 UN 271, but that is harder to remember. The Goblin orbits at such an extreme distance that it takes over 32,000 years to complete one trip around the Sun. Its closest approach to the Sun is still farther out than Pluto ever gets. But the Goblin's orbit shares characteristics with those other strange trans-Neptunian objects. It is tilted. It is elongated. It behaves like something has been gravitationally shepherding it. When Shepard ran computer simulations, the only scenario that explained the Goblin's orbit was the presence of a massive unknown planet with very specific orbital characteristics. Not just any planet, a super-Earth on a highly elliptical path. Now, the mainstream scientific position is that this hypothetical Planet 9 is in a stable orbit far beyond Neptune and poses zero threat to Earth. It is so distant that its gravitational influence on the inner solar system is negligible. This is what they tell the public. This is what makes it safe to discuss in peer-reviewed journals without causing panic. But that narrative has problems. In 1983, NASA launched the Infrared Astronomical Satellite, IRAS. It was designed to scan the entire sky in infrared wavelengths, detecting heat signatures that optical telescopes miss. In December of that year, the Washington Post ran a front-page story with the headline possibly, "As Large as Jupiter, Mystery Heavenly Body Discovered." The article described how IRAS had detected a mysterious object in the direction of the constellation Orion. Scientists could not determine if it was a planet, a dying star, or something else entirely. It was producing a heat signature, but no visible light. Then the story disappeared. When journalists followed up in later years, NASA officials said it was just a distant galaxy, nothing to see here. But independent researchers who examined the IRAS data archives found something disturbing. Certain sections of the data from that specific region of sky have been classified or redacted, not lost, not corrupted, deliberately restricted. Why would data about a distant galaxy require classification? Fast forward to 2010. NASA launches the Wide Field Infrared Survey Explorer, WISE. This spacecraft had one primary mission: scan the entire sky in infrared and catalog everything that emits heat. If a large planet existed in the outer solar system, WISE would find it. The mission ran until 2011, collecting data on over 750 million objects. In 2014, NASA announced that WISE had ruled out the existence of any Saturn-sized or larger objects out to 10,000 astronomical units. See? No Planet X. Case closed. Except the study said nothing about objects smaller than Saturn. A Neptune-sized planet or a super-Earth could absolutely be hiding in that data. And when independent astronomers requested access to the complete WISE dataset to run their own analyses, they found that significant portions had not been made publicly available. Why? Robert Harrington knew why. At least, some people believe he did. Harrington was the chief astronomer at the United States Naval Observatory in Washington, not a backyard telescope hobbyist, not a conspiracy YouTuber, the chief astronomer at one of the most prestigious observatories in America. In the 1980s and early 1990s, Harrington published multiple papers about gravitational perturbations in the outer solar system. He believed there was a planet roughly 4 times the size of Earth orbiting beyond Neptune. He calculated its likely position and was planning an observational campaign to find it. In 1993, at age 50, Robert Harrington died suddenly of esophageal cancer. From diagnosis to death took less than a year. His research into Planet X was never completed. His data was never fully published, and the Naval Observatory quietly stopped looking for undiscovered planets. Coincidence? Maybe. People die of cancer every day. but researchers who worked with Harrington later said he had been warned to drop his Planet X research, that he had been told it was a matter of national security, that he ignored those warnings, and then he got sick, and then he died. And all of his unpublished data remains locked away. You cannot prove any of that, of course. It is anecdotal. It is suspicious timing that proves nothing, but it fits a pattern. In 2008, Japanese researchers Tadashi Mukai and Patrick Lecorca published a study proposing a planet with 2 to 0.3 Earth masses in the outer solar system based on perturbations of Kuiper belt objects. Their research was peer-reviewed and accepted. Then the lead researcher stopped publishing on the topic. When asked about it years later, he would only say that his research had gone in other directions. In 2012, Brazilian astronomer Rodney Gomes presented evidence at the American Astronomical Society conference suggesting a Neptune-sized planet 4 times farther from the Sun than Neptune could explain various orbital oddities. His presentation generated significant interest. Several observatories indicated they would follow up with observations. Then nothing. The follow-up studies were never published. Gomes stopped talking about it publicly. There is a pattern here. Astronomers find evidence. They publish preliminary findings. Then either they die, they go silent, or their research gets defunded. Not every time, but often enough to make people wonder if someone does not want this planet found by the wrong people at the wrong time. Now, the rational explanation is that astronomy is hard, funding is limited, and researchers move on to other projects when initial leads do not pan out. That is probably true most of the time, but it does not explain the classified data. It does not explain why certain telescope facilities in Antarctica are restricted military zones. It does not explain why NASA felt compelled to issue specific denials about Nibiru while admitting that Planet 9 might exist. Here is what we know for certain. Multiple independent lines of evidence point to a large undiscovered planet in the outer solar system. The orbital clustering of trans-Neptunian objects cannot be explained by known planets. Computer simulations consistently show that a super-Earth, in a specific type of orbit, would produce exactly the patterns we observe, and every attempt to directly image this planet has failed, which means either it does not exist, or it is darker and farther away than current telescopes can detect, or it is being deliberately hidden from public view while governments quietly track its approach. Because if this planet is real, and if it is on an orbit that periodically brings it through the inner solar system, then its next pass could disrupt satellite communications, trigger earthquakes through gravitational stress, or send a shower of comets and asteroids toward Earth. And if the people in power know this is coming, they might decide the public does not need to know. Not yet. Not until there is nothing anyone can do about it anyway. The evidence exists. The math works. The observations match the predictions. The only question is whether the planet astronomers are finding is the same planet the Sumerians described, whether Planet 9 and Nibiru are 2 names for the same world, whether the scientific establishment is genuinely ignorant of the connection, or whether they know exactly what they are looking at and have decided that ancient prophecy is not something they want attached to their research papers. Because once you connect Planet 9 to Nibiru, once you acknowledge that ancient astronomers might have been tracking the same object, then you have to confront an uncomfortable question. If they knew about it thousands of years ago, and if it has an elliptical orbit that brings it close to the Sun, then when is it coming back? And what happens when it does? The flood came from nowhere. That is how every culture tells it. Not a gradual rising of waters. Not seasonal flooding that got out of hand. A sudden, catastrophic deluge that swallowed the world. The Sumerians said it. The Hebrews said it. The Greeks had Deucalion. The Hindus had Manu. The Chinese had Gunyu. The Aztecs had their own flood myth. The Incas, the Polynesians, Aboriginal Australians, Native American tribes from Alaska to the Amazon, over 200 distinct cultures, many of them separated by oceans and thousands of miles, all tell essentially the same story. Water came, everything drowned. A few people survived on boats or mountains. The world had to start over. Mythology, right? Primitive people trying to explain scary rainstorms or seasonal floods. That is what we have been told. Except geologists keep finding evidence that these stories might be memories of something real, something that actually happened, something so devastating that it burned itself into the collective human consciousness and never let go. Start with the obvious question. Where did all that water come from? Earth has a finite amount of water. It cycles through oceans, atmosphere, ice and groundwater, but the total amount does not change. You cannot just create enough water to cover mountains without pulling it from somewhere. So if a global flood happened, it was not about new water appearing. It was about existing water being displaced. Rapidly, violently. Picture the ocean. Now imagine something with enough gravitational pull to create a tidal bulge hundreds of feet high. Not a tsunami from an earthquake. A sustained gravitational tide that would follow the source of gravity as it moved across the sky. If a massive planetary body passed close enough to Earth, its gravity would literally pull the oceans toward it. The water would heap up on the side of Earth facing the object, creating a moving mountain of seawater that would devastate coastlines as the planet rotated beneath it. This is not speculation. This is basic physics. The moon does this to our oceans right now, just at a much smaller scale. That is what tides are. Gravitational pull. Now multiply that effect by thousands. What do you get? The flood. But we should see evidence, right? Physical proof in the geological record that the entire planet experienced sudden catastrophic flooding at roughly the same time in human history. And here is the thing. We do. The Younger Dryas period, 12,800 to 11,600 years ago, shows exactly this kind of evidence. Sediment layers from that period contain marine fossils in places that are now hundreds of miles inland and thousands of feet above sea level. Marine clay deposits in North America, seashells in the Andes, whale bones in Michigan. These are not isolated anomalies. They appear globally in strata that dates to right around the end of the last ice age. The standard explanation is glacial melt. As the ice sheets retreated, sea levels rose about 400 feet over several thousand years. But 400 feet of gradual sea level rise does not explain marine deposits at 7,000 feet elevation in mountains. It does not explain the sudden extinction of megafauna. It does not explain the massive erosion patterns that suggest fast-moving water, not slow inundation. Then there is Göbekli Tepe. If you have not heard of this site, you need to pay attention. In southeastern Turkey, archaeologists have uncovered a massive stone temple complex that dates to at least 9,600 before Christ. That is 11,600 years ago. That is older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years. Older than the pyramids by 7,000 years. This should not exist. According to everything we thought we knew about human development, humans at that time were hunter-gatherers. They had not invented agriculture yet. They lived in small nomadic groups. They definitely did not build monumental architecture with stone pillars weighing 16 tons each, carved with sophisticated artwork depicting animals and symbols. Göbekli Tepe rewrites human history. It proves that advanced civilization existed before the flood stories say the world was destroyed. And here is what makes archaeologists deeply uncomfortable. Around 9,500 before Christ, the entire complex was deliberately buried. Not abandoned, buried. Someone went to enormous effort to fill in the structures with dirt and rubble, preserving them, but hiding them. Why would you bury your most sacred site? Unless you knew something was coming. Unless you wanted to preserve the knowledge for whoever survived. Then the global flood layer appears in the geological record. Then megafauna go extinct. Then for thousands of years humanity seems to regress. No more monumental architecture. No more sophisticated settlements. Just small groups struggling to survive. Until suddenly, around 5,000 years ago, civilization explodes onto the scene again in Sumeria, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and China. All at once. All with advanced knowledge that should have taken thousands of years to develop. Almost like they were rebuilding, remembering, recovering, lost knowledge from before the cataclysm. The Black Sea was a freshwater lake until around 7,000 years ago. Then something catastrophic happened. The Mediterranean Sea, which sits at a higher elevation than the Black Sea basin did, suddenly burst through the natural land barrier at the Bosphorus. Geologists Robert Ballard and William Ryan have documented massive evidence of underwater flooding. They found ancient shorelines 400 feet below the current sea level. They found preserved human settlements drowned beneath the water. They calculated that when the Mediterranean broke through, water would have poured into the Black Sea basin with 200 times the force of Niagara Falls. Over 300 days, the water level rose, swallowing an area the size of Florida. If you lived on the shores of that lake, you would have watched the water rise every single day. You would have fled inland, warning others. You would have told stories about the great flood that destroyed your world, and those stories would get passed down. They would become legend. They would become the basis for the Noah story, the Gilgamesh story, the Atrahasis story, because it actually happened. But the Black Sea flooding does not explain the global nature of flood myths. It does not explain marine deposits on mountaintops. It does not explain extinction events. It does explain one regional catastrophe that probably did contribute to flood mythology, but something bigger happened. Something worldwide. Mammoth remains in Siberia tell a horrifying story. These massive animals, perfectly adapted to cold climates, died suddenly and in huge numbers. Not from hunting, not from gradual climate change. They froze so quickly that undigested food is still in their stomachs. Flowers and grass that they ate hours before death are still identifiable. They were flash frozen, and this happened around 12,800 years ago, right at the Younger Dryas boundary, right when the flood myths say the world was destroyed. How do you flash freeze a mammoth? How do you drop temperatures so rapidly that a multi-ton animal does not have time to digest its last meal? Some researchers propose a rapid pole shift. Others suggest a comet impact that threw debris into the atmosphere, blocking the sunday. But both scenarios have problems. A pole shift of the magnitude required would tear the planet apart. A single comet impact would not cause simultaneous catastrophe on all continents. But a massive gravitational disturbance from a passing planetary body? That could do it. That could create tidal forces in the oceans, trigger volcanic eruptions through crustal stress, cause the Earth's axis to wobble or shift slightly, and generally create havoc across the entire planet simultaneously. And then, as the object moved away, things would stabilize again. The survivors would crawl out of their caves and boats. They would look at the devastated landscape, and they would remember. They would tell their children, and their children would tell their children. And eventually, the memory would become myth. But the core truth would remain. Water came. The world ended. Only a few survived. Every ancient calendar system has a reset point. The Mayan long count begins in 3114 before Christ. The Hindu Kali Yuga age begins in 3102 before Christ. The Egyptian calendar traditionally begins around 3000 before Christ. These are not random dates. These represent the point when civilization, as those cultures understood it, began. Before that was the time of the gods, the time before, the previous world that was destroyed. Archaeological evidence supports this timeline. The oldest permanent human settlements appear around 10,000 before Christ. Organized agriculture begins around 9,000 before Christ. Complex societies develop around 4,000 before Christ. It is as if humanity hit a reset button around 12,000 years ago and had to rebuild everything from scratch. What caused that reset? What created the flood layer in global sediments? What killed the megafauna? What triggered the Younger Dryas cold period? Mainstream science points to a fragmentary comet impact. The evidence for impacts is strong. Nanodiamonds, shocked quartz, platinum anomalies, all the signatures of extraterrestrial impacts appear in the sediment layer. But where did the comet come from? Comets do not just randomly appear. They come from somewhere. They get perturbed from their normal orbits by gravitational influences. They fall toward the sunday. And if a massive planet on a highly elliptical orbit passed through the inner solar system 12,800 years ago, it would have sent a storm of comets and asteroids toward Earth. Not one impact. Multiple impacts over decades or centuries. Death from above. Repeatedly. Until finally the planet moved away and things settled down. The evidence is there in the rocks, in the ice, in the fossils, in the drowned cities and buried temples, in the stories every culture tells about the world that was destroyed. Something came. Something massive. Something that disrupted the entire planet and nearly ended humanity. The survivors remembered. They built monuments to ensure the memory survived. They encoded the warning in myths and prophecies. They calculated when it might return. And if they were right about what happened before, maybe they were right about when it happens again. Mount Graham, Arizona, 10,476 feet above sea level, sacred land to the Apache people, and home to one of the most advanced astronomical observatories in the world, operated by an organization you might not expect. The Vatican. Yes, that Vatican. The Holy See. The seat of the Catholic Church. The institution that once imprisoned Galileo for suggesting Earth orbits the Sun now runs some of the most sophisticated telescope technology on the planet. And they named one of their instruments LUCIFER. Officially, it stands for Large Binocular Telescope Near-Infrared Utility, with camera and integral field unit for extragalactic research. But come on, they knew what they were doing with that acronym. The Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, or VAT, began operations in 1993. It is not a small operation. This is serious astronomical hardware capable of detecting objects at the very edge of our solar system and far beyond. The optics are state-of-the-art. The location was specifically chosen for its exceptional viewing conditions, low light pollution, and high altitude, and the Vatican invested millions of dollars into this facility. Why? The official answer is that the Catholic Church has a long history of astronomical research. The Vatican Observatory is one of the oldest astronomical institutes in the world, dating back to 1582, when Pope Gregory XIII reformed the calendar. They employed Jesuit astronomers who made significant contributions to planetary science. They want to demonstrate that faith and science are not incompatible. They are pursuing knowledge about God's creation. All very reasonable. But that explanation does not sit right with a lot of people. The Vatican is not exactly flush with cash these days. They have been dealing with financial scandals, declining membership, and maintaining thousands of aging churches across the globe. Yet they prioritized funding for an advanced telescope in Arizona, not in Italy, not at Vatican City. In the southwestern United States, where the Apache people had considered that mountain sacred for centuries and fought to prevent any development on it, the Vatican fought them in court and won. Whatever they wanted to look at was worth that political and ethical cost. Father Jose Funes, who directed the Vatican Observatory from 2006 to 2015, made some fascinating public statements. In a 2008 interview with the Vatican newspaper, he said that believing in extraterrestrial life does not contradict Catholic faith, that if intelligent beings exist elsewhere in the universe, they would be part of God's creation, that perhaps they did not experience original sin the way humans did, that perhaps some species in the universe did not require salvation. Why was the director of the Vatican Observatory publicly theologizing about sinless alien species? That is not a question that naturally comes up unless you think encountering such beings is a possibility worth preparing for, unless someone has been asking, unless the Church knows something. In 2009, the Vatican hosted an astrobiology conference. They invited scientists from around the world to discuss the implications of discovering extraterrestrial life. One of the topics was how the revelation of intelligent alien life would impact world religions. The consensus? It would shake the foundations of human belief systems. Every major religion would have to reassess its understanding of humanity's place in the universe. But the Vatican seemed very interested in getting ahead of that conversation, in shaping the narrative before any announcement. That is the behavior of an institution preparing for something, not speculating, preparing. Brother Guy Consolmagno, who became director of the Vatican Observatory in 2015, is even more outspoken. He has stated publicly that he would baptize an alien if it asked, that the Church should be ready to welcome extraterrestrial intelligence into the faith. He has written extensively about the theological implications of contact. He does not talk about this as a fun thought experiment. He talks about it like a real scenario the Church needs to have policies for. So what are they looking at with their Arizona telescope? What is the LUCIFER instrument specifically designed to detect? Near-infrared observation is perfect for finding objects that emit heat but very little visible light, like planets, like brown dwarfs, like objects in the outer solar system that are too far from the sun to reflect much sunlight but still retain some internal heat. If you were searching for Planet X, for a massive object in a distant orbit, infrared would be exactly the spectrum you would focus on. The Vatican has never publicly stated they are searching for undiscovered planets, but they have also never provided a detailed accounting of what exactly their telescope array is being used to observe. When independent researchers have requested access to VATT observational data, they have been politely declined. The data is proprietary. The research is ongoing, perhaps in the future, not now. Then there is the location itself. Mount Graham is not just a good spot for astronomy. It is one of the best locations in the northern hemisphere for observing the southern sky. Objects with orbits that take them below the ecliptic plane, the flat disk where most planets orbit, would be easiest to observe from a location with a clear view southward at high altitude. If Nibiru's orbit is inclined relative to the other planets, as the ancient descriptions suggest, then Mount Graham would be an ideal location to watch for its approach from the south. And the Vatican is not the only organization with telescopes there. The Large Binocular Telescope, one of the most powerful optical telescopes in the world, sits right next to VAT. It is a collaboration between universities in the United States, Italy, and Germany, but access to its data is tightly controlled. And curiously, significant amounts of its observing time are dedicated to searching the outer solar system for unknown objects. What do they see during those observations? The public gets papers about distant galaxies and exoplanet research, but the raw data from those searches, classified by the partner institutions, not available for independent review. Here is the uncomfortable question nobody wants to ask directly. What if the Vatican knows? What if their astronomers, watching the skies with some of the best equipment money can buy, have tracked an approaching object that matches the ancient descriptions? What if they are watching it get closer? What if their public statements about alien life and theological preparation are not about hypothetical little green men from another star system, but about the return of something that came here before, something that ancient humans called gods? The Catholic Church has survived for 2,000 years by being very good at holding secrets. They have archives that researchers would kill to access, documents dating back centuries that have never been made public. They operate on timescales longer than governments. They think in terms of centuries, not election cycles. If they knew something catastrophic was approaching, would they tell the world? Or would they prepare quietly, position themselves to maintain authority through the chaos, and wait for the right moment to reveal what they have known all along? The telescope sits on the mountain. Every night, it turns its gaze to the southern sky. Every night, it collects data that very few people ever see. And every night, the question hangs in the cold Arizona air. What are they watching for? And have they found it? Robert Sutton Harrington did not believe in conspiracy theories. He was a scientist, a serious astronomer with a doctorate from Yale. The chief astronomer at the United States Naval Observatory, one of the most prestigious positions in American astronomy. He published in peer-reviewed journals. He calculated orbital mechanics with precision. And in the late 1980s, he became convinced that a massive undiscovered planet was orbiting beyond Neptune. Harrington called it Planet X, not in the conspiracy theory sense, but in the astronomical tradition, where X represents an unknown. He analyzed the orbits of Uranus and Neptune, looking for unexplained perturbations, tiny wobbles that could not be accounted for by known planets. He found them. The math was solid. Something out there was gravitationally tugging on the outer planets, something big. In 1988, he co-authored a paper with colleague Tom Van Flandern, proposing the existence of a planet 4 times Earth's mass, at about 100 astronomical units from the Sunday. The paper appeared in the Astronomical Journal. This was not fringe science. This was mainstream astronomical research published through proper channels. Harrington even calculated the likely position of this planet based on the perturbations. He was preparing an observational campaign to actually find it. Then things got strange. According to Van Flandern, who spoke about it years later, Harrington was contacted by government officials, not NASA, not university administrators, people from intelligence agencies. They wanted to know about his Planet X research. They wanted his calculations. They wanted to know where he was planning to look and when. Harrington thought it was odd, but cooperated. He figured they had their reasons. Maybe they wanted to coordinate with classified military satellites. Maybe they just wanted to ensure he was not accidentally stumbling onto something sensitive. In 1990, Harrington traveled to New Zealand to use telescopes in the southern hemisphere. Planet X, according to his calculations, would be most visible from there. He spent weeks observing, taking photographs, collecting data. When he returned, his colleagues noticed he seemed different, excited but also nervous. He spoke vaguely about interesting findings but said he needed to do more analysis before publishing anything. He never got the chance. In early 1993, he was diagnosed with esophageal cancer, aggressive, fast-moving. 6 months later, he was dead. He was 50 years old. A man who had been healthy, active, with no family history of cancer, was gone. His unpublished Planet X data disappeared, some of it supposedly archived at the Naval Observatory. But when researchers later requested access, they were told the files could not be located. Tom Van Flandern continued working on the Planet X hypothesis for years afterward, but he was careful, very careful. He stopped speculating about government interest. He stopped talking about what Harrington might have found in New Zealand, and when Van Flandern himself died in 2009, also of cancer, the remaining data went with him. Coincidence? Maybe. Cancer kills a lot of people, but the timing bothers people who knew them. Harrington gets close to finding Planet X. He travels specifically to observe it. He comes back with data he considers significant. Then he dies suddenly before he can publish. It fits a pattern, and he is not the only one. Rodney Marks was an astrophysicist working at the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station in Antarctica. In May 2000, he died suddenly at age 32. The official cause of death? Methanol poisoning. How does a scientist at an isolated research station end up with lethal methanol in his system? The investigation went nowhere. New Zealand authorities, who have jurisdiction over that Antarctic territory, closed the case without determining how the poisoning occurred. His colleagues said he had been working on an astronomical project involving long-period objects in the outer solar system. His research notes were confiscated. No one knows what happened to them. Then there is the case of Stephen Greer's Disclosure Project witnesses. In 2001, Greer organized a press conference at the National Press Club in Washington, where multiple military and intelligence personnel came forward to testify about UFO encounters and government secrecy. Several of these witnesses specifically mentioned concerns about objects being tracked in the outer solar system, objects that were not comets, objects that appeared to be under intelligent control or following unusual orbits. One witness, Master Sergeant Dan Morris, who claimed to have worked in intelligence with high-level clearance, stated on record that the government was tracking something coming toward the inner solar system, something they believed was an artificial object, or potentially a planet-sized body. Morris said there were contingency plans being developed, plans that included the selective survival of government officials and their families. He said the public would not be informed because there would be nothing they could do anyway, and the resulting panic would be worse than the event itself. Morris is still alive, so take that as you will. But others who spoke at that conference and continued pushing for disclosure died under questionable circumstances. Anne Livingston, who worked in FEMA and spoke about continuity of government plans related to celestial events, died in a car accident 3 years later. John Maynard, a Defense Intelligence Agency analyst who discussed tracking of near-Earth objects, died of a sudden heart attack at age 52. Ron Rummel, a security specialist who knew about classified astronomical data, died from a gunshot officially ruled suicide. Again, people die. Accidents happen. But when multiple witnesses to the same classified information die within a few years of going public, pattern recognition starts kicking in. In 2007, a man using the pseudonym Norwegian politician posted on an internet forum claiming to be a government official who had been briefed on Planet X. He said that governments around the world knew it was coming, that Norway was building massive underground seed vaults and bunker systems, that the elite had plans to survive in underground facilities while the surface population dealt with catastrophic pole shifts and flooding. The post included specific details about the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, which at the time was still under construction and not widely known to the public. 2 years later, the Svalbard Vault opened, just as described, a massive underground facility built to survive any catastrophe, containing seeds from every major food crop on Earth. Officially, it exists as insurance against agricultural collapse from climate change or nuclear war. But the scale of it, the location in the remote Arctic, the depth of the facility carved into solid rock, suggests preparation for something more severe than gradual warming or even full-scale nuclear exchange. The Norwegian politician post has never been verified. The person who wrote it never revealed their identity. It could be an elaborate hoax, but it predicted a real facility before it was publicly announced, and it laid out a scenario that matches what other whistleblowers have claimed, that governments know, that the wealthy elite are preparing, that the rest of us will be left to figure it out when it is too late to do anything. Bob Dean, a retired Army Command Sergeant Major who claimed to have worked at NATO's Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, spoke extensively before his death in 2018 about classified assessments he had read regarding objects approaching Earth from deep space. Dean said that starting in the 1960s, military installations were tracking anomalous objects that did not fit the profile of comets or asteroids, objects that changed trajectory, objects that appeared on predictable schedules. He claimed that by the 1980s, the conclusion among military astronomers was that these were either advanced spacecraft or planetary bodies on highly elliptical orbits that brought them through the inner solar system periodically. Dean showed what he claimed were authentic classified documents, though their authenticity was never independently verified. He said the reason for the secrecy was simple. If the public knew that governments had been tracking a potential extinction-level object for decades and had made no effort to warn people or prepare defensive measures, there would be revolution. Better to let people live their lives in ignorance. Better to build bunkers for the chosen few, and let nature take its course for everyone else. Is any of this true? Impossible to say with certainty. Whistleblowers can lie. Documents can be forged. People who claim inside knowledge might be attention-seeking or mentally unwell. But the sheer number of people, many with legitimate credentials and backgrounds, saying essentially the same thing creates a problem. Either this is the most coordinated disinformation campaign in history, or there is something real being covered up. And the people who get too close to that truth seem to have a habit of dying before they can prove it. Neptune is moving wrong, not dramatically, not in a way that threatens its orbit or sends astronomers into panic, just slightly off. A tiny deviation from where Newtonian physics says it should be. Uranus, too. Both ice giants show perturbations that the presence of Neptune alone cannot fully explain. We have known about these anomalies since the Voyager missions in the 1980s. The standard response has been to refine our models, adjust for solar wind, account for mass distributions we might have miscalculated, but the deviations persist. Something is pulling on them, something we cannot see. In 2019, astronomers noticed something odd about a distant trans-Neptunian object designated far, far out. It holds the record as the most distant object ever observed in our solar system, at 140 astronomical units from the Sunday. That is 140 times farther from the Sun than Earth. At that distance, the Sun is just another bright star in the sky. Far, far out takes over 1,000 years to complete one orbit. But here is what made astronomers uncomfortable. Far, far out's orbit is not circular. It is wildly elliptical. At its closest approach, it comes within 50 astronomical units of the Sunday. At its farthest, it reaches 175 astronomical units. That kind of orbit does not happen randomly. Something massive kicked far, far out into that trajectory. Something that exerted enough gravitational force to fundamentally alter its path through space. The discoverers ran simulations. Every scenario that produced far, far out's current orbit required the presence of a super-Earth in the outer solar system, not Neptune. Neptune cannot produce that effect from where it sits. Something bigger, something farther out, something that has not been directly observed. Then there are the Kuiper Belt objects that orbit perpendicular to everything else. The Kuiper Belt is the region beyond Neptune, filled with icy bodies left over from the solar system's formation. Most of these objects orbit in roughly the same plane as the planets, a flat disk around the Sunday. That is how solar systems work. Everything forms from a rotating disk of matter, so everything ends up orbiting in that same plane. Except some objects orbit perpendicular to that disk, straight up and down relative to the planetary plane. Objects like Drac and Nibiru, which have orbital inclinations over 110 degrees, they orbit backwards and tilted at extreme angles. That should not be possible, unless something gravitationally disturbed them, something that came through at an angle to the normal planetary plane, something massive enough to grab these objects and fling them into perpendicular orbits. When you simulate that scenario, you need a planet roughly 10 Earth masses on a highly inclined orbit. You need something that passes through the Kuiper belt at a steep angle, disrupting objects as it goes. You need exactly the kind of orbit ancient descriptions of Nibiru describe. Comet trajectories present another puzzle. Long-period comets, the ones that take hundreds or thousands of years to orbit the Sun, are supposed to come from the Oort cloud, a theoretical sphere of icy objects surrounding the solar system far beyond the Kuiper belt. When something disturbs an Oort cloud object, it falls toward the Sun, swings around, and heads back out. Simple gravitational mechanics. But statistical analysis of long-period comet trajectories shows clustering. More comets arrive from certain directions than others. More comets have their perihelia, their closest approach to the Sun, in certain regions of space than random distribution would predict. It is as if something out there is preferentially sending comets toward us from specific angles, something with enough mass to gravitationally shepherd these objects toward the inner solar system. Jupiter does this on a small scale. Its massive gravity captures comets and asteroids, sometimes flinging them inward. But Jupiter cannot account for the specific clustering patterns we observe. The math requires something else, something farther out with a different orbital geometry. In 2023, something strange happened with Comet Leonard. This comet, discovered in January 2021, was predicted to make its closest approach to the Sun in December of that year. Astronomers calculated its trajectory based on standard gravitational models. Everything looked normal. Then, as it approached, Leonard started behaving oddly. It brightened unexpectedly. Its tail showed unusual structure, and its trajectory shifted slightly, as if it had experienced an unexpected gravitational tug. Mission controllers dismissed it as outgassing, jets of sublimating ice pushing the comet off course. That happens. But amateur astronomers tracking Leonard noticed something else. The trajectory change occurred when the comet was in a specific region of space, a region where, according to Planet 9 models, a massive unseen planet might be orbiting. Was Leonard's course altered by passing near something we cannot see? Something massive enough to gravitationally nudge a comet, but too dark to observe directly? We will never know for certain because Leonard was a one-time visitor. It will never return. It now has enough velocity to leave the solar system entirely. Then there are the satellite anomalies. Since 2015, an unusual number of satellites and space probes have experienced unexplained malfunctions. Hitomi, a Japanese X-ray astronomy satellite, spun out of control in 2016 and broke apart. Cause unknown. Schiaparelli, a European Mars lander, crashed in 2016 after its guidance system failed. Cause unclear. India's Chandrayaan-2 lunar lander lost contact and crashed in 2019. Russia's Phobos Grunt Mars probe failed in 2011. NASA's Glory satellite failed to reach orbit in 2011. Space missions fail. Equipment malfunctions. But the rate of failures involving specifically astronomical and planetary science missions has been statistically higher than expected, and several of these missions were designed to study the outer solar system or to scan for unknown objects. Is it coincidence that missions looking in certain directions tend to fail more often? Or is someone ensuring that certain data never gets collected? The Sun itself is acting strangely. Solar Cycle 25, which began in 2019, has been more active than predicted. Sunspots, solar flares, coronal mass ejections. The Sun's magnetic field shows unusual fluctuations. Standard solar physics models have had to be revised repeatedly because the Sun is not behaving as expected. Could the Sun be responding to external gravitational influence? Stars are sensitive to the gravitational fields of orbiting bodies. A massive planet on a highly elliptical orbit would exert tidal forces on the Sun itself as it approached. Those forces would manifest as increased stellar activity, more sunspots, more flares, exactly what we are observing. In 2022, astronomers detected unusual gravitational lensing in deep space observations. Gravitational lensing occurs when a massive object bends light from more distant sources. We use it to detect dark matter and distant galaxies. But some of the lensing events detected did not match known objects. The light was being bent by something in our own solar system, something between us and the background stars, something massive enough to warp space-time but invisible to our telescopes. Follow-up observations found nothing. The region of space where the lensing occurred appeared empty, but the light had definitely been bent. By what? All of these anomalies individually have prosaic explanations. Orbital mechanics are complex. Comet behavior is unpredictable. Satellites fail. The Sun has natural cycles. Gravitational lensing can be misinterpreted. Any one anomaly means nothing, but when you line them all up, when you see the pattern, when you recognize that every single one of these anomalies would be explained by the presence of a massive unseen planet on a highly elliptical, highly inclined orbit, then coincidence starts to feel like willful blindness. The universe is trying to tell us something. The math is screaming that something is out there. The question is whether we are listening, and whether we will figure it out in time. The Hopi elders saw it coming decades ago, not through telescopes, not through mathematical calculations, through prophecy passed down for generations. They call it the blue star Kachina. According to Hopi tradition, the appearance of the blue star signals the beginning of the end times. Not the end of the world necessarily, but the end of this world, the fourth world, the transition to the fifth. And after the blue star appears, the red star Kachina follows, the purifier, the destroyer, the one that cleanses the earth so the new world can begin. In 1998, a Hopi elder named White Feather spoke to a minister and described the signs. He said 9 prophecies must be fulfilled before the day of purification arrives. 8 have already happened. The coming of white men, roads crossing the landscape, horseless carriages, iron snakes, the railroads, a gourd of ashes falling from the sky, the atomic bombs. When the 9th sign appears, the blue star, the end begins. White Feather died before specifying exactly what the blue star would look like, but he said many would see it, that it would appear in the heavens for all to witness. In 2005, astronomers discovered a star called V838 Monocerotis that suddenly brightened and turned blue. It expanded, glowed brilliantly blue for several months, then faded. Space enthusiasts nicknamed it the Blue Star. Hopi watchers took notice. Was this it? The prophecy warned that after the blue star came visible, the red star would follow, and then the earth would shake, the seas would rise, fire would fall from the sky. But here is what makes this prophecy genuinely eerie. The Hopi have no telescopes, no ancient astronomical records written on clay tablets. Their prophecies were oral, passed from generation to generation, deliberately not written down to prevent contamination or misinterpretation. Yet their description of celestial events matches what other ancient cultures the Hopi never had contact with, also describe. The Hindu Vedas speak of the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness and destruction that precedes renewal. According to traditional calculations, the Kali Yuga began in 3102 before Christ and lasts for 432,000 years. Except some interpretations suggest a different timeline, that the depths of Kali Yuga, the darkest period, occurs not at the end but in cycles within the age. And according to some Hindu astronomers, we are approaching the end of one such cycle now. Between 2020 and 2030, depending on which calculation method you use. The symptoms of late Kali Yuga? Moral collapse. Truth becomes rare. Leaders rule through deception. Natural disasters increase in frequency and severity. And most importantly, a great celestial event occurs that either destroys or transforms civilization, after which a new golden age begins. Sound familiar? The Tibetan Buddhist prophecies speak of Shambhala, a hidden kingdom that will reveal itself when the world reaches its darkest hour. The king of Shambhala will lead an army against the forces of destruction. But before that happens, the prophecies describe celestial signs, a dark star that cannot be seen until it is close, earthquakes and floods, mountains falling into the sea. The prophecy of Kalachakra, the Wheel of Time, describes this as a cyclical event, something that has happened before, something encoded in the cosmic calendar. Tibetan monks maintain astronomical charts that date back over 2,000 years. These charts track not just planets and stars, but also what they call ghost planets, celestial bodies that appear and disappear on long cycles. When asked what these ghost planets are, the monks describe them as harbingers, as signs of transformation. They say the charts predict the return of such a body between 2025 and 2035. Right now, this decade, the Book of Revelation, written 2,000 years ago by John of Patmos, describes a great red dragon in heaven, 7 heads, 10 horns, a tail that sweeps a third of the stars from the sky and hurls them to earth. Most Christian scholars interpret this as purely symbolic: Satan, evil, spiritual warfare. But what if John was describing something he actually saw in a vision, something celestial? A planet with multiple moons, 7 visible satellites appearing red in the sky, whose gravitational influence sends asteroids and comets toward Earth. Revelation describes the aftermath. Mountains and islands moved from their places, the sky rolling up like a scroll, stars falling to Earth, the sun turning black and the moon turning red. These are not metaphors you create from nothing. These are descriptions of geological upheaval, atmospheric disturbances, and impact events. These are what you would see if a massive planetary body passed close to Earth. The timing? Revelation does not give specific dates, but other biblical prophecies do. The book of Daniel describes 70 weeks of years, 490 years, leading to the end of the age. Scholars have argued for centuries about when that countdown started, but several interpretations place the culmination in this current decade, between now and 2030. Again, the same window. Nostradamus, love him or hate him, made some very specific astronomical predictions. In his quatrains, he describes a great celestial body approaching Earth. Century 2, Quatrain 43, during the appearance of the bearded star, the 3 great princes will be made enemies, struck from the sky. Peace, earth quaking. A bearded star is a comet. But he also mentions in other quatrains a massive planetary body, something he calls the Great King of Terror, descending from the sky. Most famously, he predicted this would happen in July 1999. It did not. Nostradamus fans spent decades trying to explain why. But what if he was not wrong about the event, just imprecise about the timing? What if he was describing something he saw in genuine prophetic visions, but had no way to accurately date because he lived in the 16th century without modern calendars or astronomical knowledge? What if the event he foresaw is not in the past but still approaching? The Mayan long count calendar became famous because of the 2012 hysteria. The calendar ended on December 21st, 2012, and people assumed that meant the end of the world. It did not. The world continued. So everyone dismissed the Mayan prophecy as nonsense. But here is what almost nobody mentions. The Mayans never said the world would end on that date. They said it marked the end of an age and the beginning of a new cycle, a transition period. Not a single day of destruction, but the start of a transformation that would unfold over years or decades. The Mayans were master astronomers. Their calendar tracked Venus with accuracy that modern computers confirm. They knew the precession of the equinoxes. They calculated eclipse cycles. When they set their calendar to reset on that specific date, they were marking something astronomically significant: the alignment of Earth with the galactic center, the end of a 26,000-year cycle, but also, according to some Mayan researchers, the approximate return time of a celestial body they had tracked in ancient times, a body that last passed through the inner solar system around 3114 before Christ. Add 3,600 years. You get 486 before Christ. Add another cycle. You get 114 after Christ. Add another. You get 3,714 after Christ. Wait, that math does not work. Unless the cycle is not exactly 3,600 years. Unless it varies based on gravitational interactions with other planets. Unless the Mayans rounded to a number that made calendrical sense. If the actual cycle is closer to 3,500 years with some variation, then the timeline matches much better. 3114 before Christ plus 3500 equals approximately 2,614. Way off. But if you account for the fact that ancient dating systems were not precise, that our conversion of ancient calendars to modern dates involves assumptions that the cycle might not be perfectly regular, then a return window opening around 2012 and extending through 2035 starts to make disturbing sense. Every major spiritual tradition describes this era as the end of an age. Native American prophecies, Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime predictions, African tribal oral histories, Polynesian navigational myths. Separately, without contact with each other, cultures around the world encoded the same warning. Something comes from the sky, something that has come before, something that transforms everything. They could all be wrong. Every single culture could have independently invented apocalyptic prophecies because humans fear the future and create myths to cope with that fear. That is the rational explanation. But the specificity bothers people. The astronomical details that primitive cultures should not have known. The timeline convergence that places most of these prophecies pointing to right now. This decade. This moment in history. Either this is the most remarkable coincidence in human civilization, or every ancient culture was trying to warn us about the same event. An event they had experienced before. An event they calculated would happen again. An event that, according to their best knowledge, is happening now. The blue star has appeared. The red star follows. The purification comes. Not because gods are angry or demons are rising, but because the cosmos operates on cycles. We forgot how to read. Until now. Until we started looking up again and realized the ancients were not telling stories. They were keeping time. And the clock is about to strike. So let us say, just for a moment, that some of this is true. Not all of it. Maybe not even most of it. But some kernel of reality exists beneath the theories and prophecies and anomalies. A massive planetary body is on a long elliptical orbit. It periodically swings through the inner solar system, and we are approaching one of those periods. What do you actually do with that information? Panic does not help. Ignoring it completely might be worse. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, somewhere between building a bunker in your backyard and pretending everything is fine. First, let us establish what we can actually verify. You do not need a doctorate in astronomy to observe the night sky. You need a clear night, some patience, and maybe a decent pair of binoculars or a small telescope. Amateur astronomers have discovered comets, tracked asteroids, and contributed real data to scientific databases. If a large object is approaching the inner solar system, amateur observers will see it eventually, regardless of what governments or institutions choose to disclose. The sky belongs to everyone. No one can hide a planet once it gets close enough. So start watching, learn the constellations, download a star chart app, join an amateur astronomy club in your area. Familiarize yourself with what the night sky normally looks like, so you will recognize when something changes. If a new bright object appears that was not there before, especially one that moves against the background, stars over days or weeks, that is worth investigating. Document it, photograph it, share your observations with others. Crowdsourced astronomy has become remarkably powerful. Second, understand the difference between preparation and paranoia. Preparing for potential disasters is rational, regardless of whether Nibiru exists. Earthquakes happen, hurricanes happen, economic collapses happen, power grid failures happen. Having emergency supplies, a water filtration system, stored food, basic medical supplies, and a plan for your family is just good sense. Whether the threat is a passing planet, a solar flare, or a simple natural disaster, the preparations are largely the same. FEMA actually has decent guidelines for disaster preparedness. 2 weeks of food and water per person, first aid supplies, battery-powered radio, flashlights, medications, copies of important documents in waterproof containers. You do not need to spend thousands of dollars or turn your home into a fortress. You just need enough to survive a temporary disruption of normal services. Third, develop critical thinking skills that let you evaluate extraordinary claims without either dismissing them reflexively or accepting them uncritically. When someone presents evidence for Nibiru or Planet X, ask questions. What is the source? Can it be verified independently? Are there alternative explanations? Does the claim require you to believe that thousands of professional astronomers are either incompetent or lying? That is a big ask. Not impossible, but it requires strong evidence. At the same time, do not automatically trust authority just because it is authority. Institutions have been wrong before. They have covered up inconvenient truths before. Tobacco was safe until it was not. Lead in gasoline was fine until it was not. Trust, but verify. Look at the data yourself when possible. Demand transparency, and recognize that the absence of proof is not proof of absence. Fourth, understand the actual astronomical threats we know are real. Near-Earth asteroids are not theoretical. They exist. They have hit Earth before. They will hit Earth again. NASA and other space agencies track thousands of them. Some will pass harmlessly, others might not. The difference is, we have the technology now to potentially deflect a dangerous asteroid if we detect it early enough. The DART mission in 2022 successfully changed an asteroid's trajectory. It works. We can defend ourselves if we see the threat coming. Solar flares and coronal mass ejections are also real threats. A massive solar storm could knock out power grids, destroy satellites, and disrupt communications globally. The Carrington event of 1859, the largest recorded solar storm, would be catastrophic if it happened today. Our technological civilization is far more vulnerable to electromagnetic disruption than most people realize. Preparing for a solar event means having backup power, stored food, and ways to communicate that do not rely on the internet or cell networks. These are tangible, documented threats that do not require believing in ancient prophecies or hidden planets. They are worth preparing for regardless. Fifth, maintain perspective. If a planet-sized object were going to impact Earth next month, there would be nothing you or anyone else could do to stop it. Bunkers might buy you time, but not survival if the surface becomes uninhabitable. At a certain scale of catastrophe, individual preparation becomes meaningless. That is actually liberating in a way. It means you do not have to live in constant fear. You prepare reasonably. You stay informed. You take precautions that make sense. And then you live your life. Because here is the thing nobody wants to say out loud. If the ancient prophecies are right, if Nibiru returns and causes the kind of devastation the texts describe, then survival is only the first challenge. Rebuilding is the real test. And that requires community, skills, knowledge, adaptability. Humanity has survived extinction-level events before. We are still here. We are remarkably resilient as a species. The people who survive catastrophes are not necessarily the ones with the most supplies or the biggest bunkers. They are the ones who can think clearly under pressure, who can cooperate with others, who have practical skills, and who can adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. Those are the traits worth cultivating regardless of what threat you are preparing for. So where does that leave us? With questions mostly. Questions about what is really out there. Questions about what ancient people knew. Questions about what modern institutions are telling us or not telling us. And questions about what we should do with incomplete information and uncertain timelines. The only honest answer is that we do the best we can. We observe. We prepare reasonably. We stay curious. We remain skeptical, but open-minded. And we remember that whether Nibiru is real or not, the universe is vast, ancient, and full of things we do not yet understand. Our ancestors looked up at the same stars and tried to make sense of what they saw. We are doing the same thing, just with better tools. Maybe we will figure it out in time. Maybe we will not. But the attempt itself, the search for truth in the darkness, that is what makes us human. 2 hours ago, You started watching this documentary with a question. Is Nibiru real? Will the Anunnaki return? Should we believe the ancient prophecies or trust the scientists who say it is all nonsense? By now, you probably realize the answer is not simple. It never was. We have looked at Sumerian tablets that describe planetary systems ancient people should not have known about. We have examined mathematical cycles that appear in geological catastrophes with disturbing regularity. We have explored modern astronomical discoveries that keep finding evidence of massive hidden planets exactly where the ancient texts said to look. We have listened to whistleblowers who died before they could prove their claims. We have seen prophecies from disconnected cultures all pointing to the same timeline. Our timeline. So, what is the truth? Here is what we know for absolute certain. Something caused massive global catastrophes approximately 12,800 years ago. The evidence is in the rock layers, the ice cores, the extinct species, and the flood myths that every culture tells. Something disrupted Earth so severely that human civilization essentially reset. That is not conspiracy theory. That is accepted science. We also know that anomalies exist in our solar system that current models cannot fully explain. Neptune and Uranus wobble slightly. Distant objects orbit in patterns that require gravitational influence from something we have not found. Mainstream astronomers from Caltech openly discuss the likelihood of a massive undiscovered planet. That is also not conspiracy. That is published research. What we do not know is whether these two facts connect. Whether the Planet 9 that scientists are searching for is the same world the Sumerians called Nibiru. Whether its orbit really does bring it through the inner solar system on a timeline that matches ancient prophecies. Whether it will return in our lifetimes or our children's lifetimes or at all. And here is the uncomfortable truth. We might not get an answer before it is too late to matter. If a massive planet is approaching on a highly elliptical orbit from below the ecliptic plane, we might not see it until it is very close. Optical telescopes struggle to detect dark objects that reflect little sunlight. Infrared surveys can find them, but only if they are looking in exactly the right place at the right time. By the time Nibiru becomes visible to amateur observers with backyard telescopes, if it ever does, the time for preparation will have passed. That uncertainty is precisely why this topic generates such intense debate. We cannot prove it is coming. We also cannot prove it is not. And in that gap between proof and disproof, fear and hope compete for territory. So what should you do with this information? That depends on who you are. If you are a skeptic who needs absolute proof before accepting extraordinary claims, then nothing presented here will convince you. And that is fine. Skepticism is healthy. Demand evidence, question everything, hold researchers to high standards, but also stay curious. Keep watching the data. Science has been wrong before and will be wrong again. Truth has a way of emerging eventually. If you are someone who already believed in Nibiru before watching this, hopefully you now understand the importance of distinguishing between what we can verify and what we are speculating about. Ancient texts are real. Astronomical anomalies are real. But interpreting them requires humility. We might be seeing patterns that are not there. We might be connecting dots that do not actually form a picture. Critical thinking protects us from becoming so invested in a theory that we ignore contradictory evidence. And if you are somewhere in the middle, uncertain but intrigued, then congratulations. You are thinking correctly. The truth about Nibiru, if there is a truth, probably lives in that grey area between dismissal and certainty. Something interesting is happening in our solar system. Ancient cultures knew more than we give them credit for. Whether those two facts connect in the dramatic way Sitchin proposed, or whether they are separate mysteries that happen to coincide, that remains to be seen. Here is your challenge. Do not take anyone's word for it. Not mine, not NASA's. Not ancient priests or modern astronomers or conspiracy theorists on the internet. Look up, watch the sky. Learn the tools of observation and analysis. Become part of the distributed network of humans who refuse to simply accept what they are told. Because if Nibiru is real, if the return prophecy is accurate, the official confirmation will not come from a government press conference or a peer-reviewed paper. It will come from thousands of ordinary people looking up and seeing something that was not there before. Something massive, something undeniable, something that makes every ancient text suddenly make terrible sense. The sky does not lie, numbers do not lie, rocks and ice and bones tell the truth about what happened before. The question is whether we are willing to listen, whether we are brave enough to consider that our ancestors, dismissed as primitive and superstitious, might have been trying to warn us about something real, something that destroyed their world, something that might be coming back to test ours. The 3,600-year cycle may or may not be real. The Anunnaki may or may not return. But the possibility, however remote, however unproven, deserves more than mockery or blind dismissal. It deserves investigation. It deserves honest inquiry. It deserves our attention. Because if they were right, if the ancient astronomers calculated correctly and encoded their knowledge in myths and monuments and mathematical cycles, then we are living in the return window right now, this decade, these years. And the ultimate question is not whether Nibiru exists. The ultimate question is whether we will see it coming, and what we will do when we finally look up and realize the ancients were not telling stories, they were keeping watch, and now it is our turn. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person who needs to see what we uncover next. Hit subscribe, because this story is far from over.